While they settle in with the cherries, I shall welcome. Good morning and welcome to Classical Encounters, the first of today's events. I'm delighted to welcome Adam Nicholson and Charlotte Higgins, together with our chair for today, journalist and biographer Imogen Lycett Green. Charlotte Higgins is The Guardian's chief arts writer. Her new book, Under Another Sky, Journeys in Roman Britain, shortlisted for the Samuel Johnston Prize, is a deeply engaging exploration of the evidence of Roman Britain and its legacy today. It has been described as delightful, effortlessly engaging, utterly original by the Times. Ruth Padell in The New Statesman said, Under Another Sky should be on every shelf in the UK. Hurrah. Here's to that. You can get your copy later. Adam Nicholson writes about English history, landscape and the sea. He won the Royal Society of Literature's Ondaatje Prize for the book about his family home, Sissinghurst, An Unfinished History, and his forthcoming book, The Mighty Dead, Why Homer Matters, has just been released. So please do join me in welcoming Imogen, Charlotte and Adam for what will undoubtedly be a fascinating discussion about how we can understand the present through the lens of the past. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll just start by saying that Charlotte's book was published last August in hardback and has come round to paperback. Adam's came out about 3 days ago. So we've all been speed reading it. And Charlotte, it took a little longer to write, didn't it? But Charlotte reviewed Adam's book in The Guardian last week, luckily favourably. Otherwise, I'd be sitting in the middle of the two of them, I think. But I wanted to start by asking both of you, both of these books are quests in a way. They're about searching and about asking questions. And I wanted to ask what set you off on your journey, Adam, to find out who Homer is and why he's important. Was there a Damascene moment? Was there a...
Yeah, there was. I had studied Greek at school incredibly reluctantly. It always seemed to me like, you know, when you're in a Spanish restaurant, you get a kind of a very attractive but utterly bony fish that you spend your entire time picking through the skeleton to try and find a little bit of flesh. That's what Greek at school to me was like. And only years and years later, maybe about 17, 18 years ago now, I was sailing on the west coast of Ireland. We had a very stormy, wild, rough time. And I had just thrown a copy of the Odyssey into my luggage as just something I thought I might read of an evening. And one night, tied up next to an Irish quay, I started to read the translation by the great American scholar, translator, poet Robert Fagles. And I suddenly felt a disuse sort of enter me. I suddenly felt that this man, or this figure, this great sort of mythical human figure, was someone I could identify with, and that his journeys through these wild seas, arriving at these delicious islands filled with or occupied by strangely alluring women who make him sleep with him for 7 years at a time and feed him delicious dinners every evening. And yet, nevertheless, filling him with kind of grief and longing for home. All of these things were not really something old and dead, but mine and here and now. And it was revelatory. It was like, oh, I see. So here is a description of the truth of being alive. I think that's what it came to. Here was somehow a voice from the base reality line of existence.
But that hadn't made sense to you when you were 8 and reading it then? And
no, I think it's a key. I think you have to be old.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Charlotte, because you're a classic scholar and you've obviously read the Odyssey and the Iliad many times. And here you are, having written a book about Greece and a book about Latin, I think, and you're working full time as the Guardian Arts head of the arts or arts writer, and you make the time to go on this journey over 2 summers. And what set you off on this journey at this point in your life?
Well, again, I mean, not totally although it's quite a different proposition, because I wasn't thinking about a piece of literature so much as a nation and its history and its landscape. But I also had a Damascene moment, which was, I'd studied classics. I studied classics at university, and then went off to be a journalist. And the classics sort of ebbs and flows in my life, and sometimes I was more interested in it, and sometimes I was less interested in it, but it was always there. But I'd never really thought about Roman Britain at all. It wasn't part of my education, except for an incredibly dreary, kind of wintry little school trip in a very sick-making minibus from Stoke-on-Trent, where I grew up to Hadrian's Wall, and we kind of got out of the little minivan and we looked at the fort, and there were very well preserved toilets in Housesteads, which is one of the great forts in the centre of the wall, and we were quite interested in that. And there was a little English heritage sign with the squaddies on the labs. That was quite, that was
sponges.
Sponges.
Yeah, I remember the sponges.
Firmly imprinted on my mind. But it all seemed a bit dreary. And for me, classics was much more about the warm south and draughts of Keatsian, nectar and
Hippocrene.
That sort of thing. And better weather and better food and so forth. So I never really thought about the classics as it relates to the classical world, as it relates to the land that we lived in, until much later in adulthood, about 7 years ago, I went up to Hadrian's Wall again, and on a day of better weather, let it be said, and there's a real true magnificence of it, stretching across the Cumbrian Northumberland landscape on the top of this wonderful igneous outcrop of rock, so it's on the wind still in its central portion, which it looks as if it's sort of poised on the crest of a wave that goes across the landscape. Absolutely stunningly beautiful. And I started to think about how it's, well, like Adam was saying, he realised that it was about the here and now and him at that moment. It suddenly seemed to me not so much a kind of thing that was to do with 122 AD, which was when it was built, but also something that had lived in the British landscape, had been had been encountered by people throughout its history, about which myths had been woven, about which careful histories had been uncovered, and amid which people had lived and farmed and stolen bits of it and quarried it and built roads over it. And, and it was when Foot and Mouth came in 2003, one of the farmers who farms on the wall told me to travel along the wall. So it's been a focus of life for 2,000 years. And so that's what became the starting point for the book, was what does this physical landscape of ruins and emotional landscape and intellectual landscape of ideas mean for us now, and what has it meant in the past? So that's what started me off.
And you both set off on these journeys, and you involve in both of your books, you weave in all the people in history who have set off on a similar quest, and particularly Adam, particularly vivid at the beginning of your book is Keats's moment when he reads Chapman's Homer and how he writes his ode. And then you talk about Milman Parry, and I want to come back to Milman Parry in relation to all the wild archaeologists that you mentioned, particularly Mortimer Wheeler. But you weave in this journey. I mean, can you tell us just about how in each different generation, everybody interprets it in a different way. So you've come to it now, but what was Keats thinking when what did it mean to him?
Well, this was the really lovely phrase in a really great review of the book written in The Guardian the other day. And which said that, it didn't actually say both books, but both these books are about this, and it's about a conversation which knows no time boundaries. That there is an endless conversation between present and past within Homer, within these wonderful, suggestive, fragmentary ruins that Charlotte's book kind of unearths almost. I mean, it's like a kind of archaeology of the conversation almost. You're sort of drawing voices out of the past. And the Keats moment is very exciting. He's very young, he's sort of 21. I think he's just about to be 21. And he goes and visits an old friend of his, the son of his schoolmaster, Charles Cowden Clarke. And Charles Cowden Clarke happens to have been lent a great big 17th century leather-bound folio of a translation of Homer made by George Chapman, the Elizabethan and Jacobean poet, in 1607, I think it was published. And they, deep into the night, with plenty of the Hippocrene winking at the brim, pore over this, and sort of diving into it, looking for what Cowden Clarke calls our favoritist passages. And it's like they're kind of looking into an aquarium, sort of picking out delicious little fish like this. And Keats suddenly finds this amazing phrase about when Odysseus, right in the middle of the Odyssey, has been wrecked by a giant storm by Poseidon wanting to destroy him, and he's been tossed to and fro for days and days. And the Greek says that he had been tamed. Dedmito is the Greek word. He'd been tamed. But Chapman translated that word as the sea had soaked his heart through. And Keats just thinks, Christ alive, how magical is that? That is what I want from poetry. He'd been exposed to Alexander Pope's translation, or previously very polite, very elegant, very 18th century, very classical, but the sea had soaked his heart through, was somehow reaching into underlayers of life, pre-classic, deeper, more physical and visceral than that. And that is exactly, I'm very, very Keatsian about Homer, that he shouldn't be thought of as some elegant classical construction. He's from an earlier level than that. And the earlier level is about the nature of existence, really, and pain. It's full of delight, my book.
The idea of language comes up, words coming from the past. With yours, Adam, a lot of words hanging in the wind almost and gathered by each generation. But in yours, Charlotte, there's very specific words. And you were talking just now about walking along Hadrian's Wall. And then later you talk about the Vindolanda Tablets and finding the words, and there's a particularly moving part at the end of that chapter where you connect with this woman in the past, and I just wanted you to talk about those Vindolanda Tablets.
Sure. Well, the Vindolanda Tablets, as a lot of you probably know, are a cache of first century pieces of writing found south of Hadrian's Wall, and actually somewhat predating Hadrian's Wall, but from a fort, from the settlement around the fort. And they started to be discovered in the late 70s, and then there was a kind of great emergence of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these items. And when I say tablets, they are little postcard-sized, normally, bits of bark, which have been preserved in the lovely, anaerobic, do I mean that? Anyway, muck of the landscape, with tiny scratched, all very, very difficult to decipher Latin cursive handwriting on them. And this discovery really transforms understanding of the Roman world, really, because it was an enormous cache of, not shopping lists, but the memos, kind of fragmentary letters, just ordinary bits of administrative writing, but some very personal drafts of letters, the sort of thing saying, could you, send me some apples, please, and, I need warmer socks, and I'm going to go hunting, and one of these, and by the way, this is the biggest cache of, as it were, ordinary bits of Roman handwriting to emerge anywhere in the Roman world. So suddenly, Roman Britain has become hugely important in the understanding of the Roman world far and wide. But, aside from the papyri in Egypt, which is obviously a bit more significant, but anyway, they're frightfully important. They're frightfully important. And what Imogen is referring to, I suppose, the thing about Roman Britain, one of the many things about Roman Britain for me, is that I am kind of obsessed with the idea of its irrecoverability. It seems very, in fact, the classical world, tout court, almost seems incredibly present to us sometimes, because you have the immediacy of recognition of emotion in Homer, let's say, or in an Ovid or a Horace poem. But at the same time, there's this sort of enormous gulf and impossibility of understanding. And this seems very, somehow in Roman Britain, this effect is very magnified in the sense that it's so fragmentary. You know, there are good sources on Roman Britain at the beginning of the period. They've got Tacitus and Julius Caesar writing about it, which is really extraordinary. And then there are whole centuries where there's very little, or only very fragmentary epigraphic evidence and so forth. And so in my life, I find it coming towards me and then sort of disappearing into the distance, hard to grasp, leaving us with a kind of multiplicity of possible interpretations. You know, the thing about the particular tablet that Imogen is describing is it's in the British Museum, and it's a tablet in which one Roman woman based at this camp in Vindolanda is writing to another one, and she's inviting her to her birthday party. I mean, heaven knows what a Roman birthday party, I mean, it sounds very familiar, but goodness knows what that means. But it, you know, come to a celebration, and it's written quite formally, obviously by a scribe, because scribes have neat handwriting, and we can normally tell when a scribe has written one of these tablets. But the end, the sign-off, is in kind of wobbly, rubbish handwriting, and it's a little sign of Carissima Soror, my dearest sister, please come to my party, you know, kind of lots of love. And in that moment, you're looking her in the eye almost, and it's extraordinarily present, and it's sort of strangely as if she's there. And it's probably the first example of a woman's handwriting from anywhere in the Roman world. Yeah. So I advise you to go and see it in the British Museum. It's
well,
wonderful.
I can confess here that having read Charlotte's book the day before yesterday, I went to the British Museum to see that very thing, and there it is, and it glows and radiates at you for this emotional life from 2,000 years ago. So we could all leave now.
But we don't. But it's very important in your book, because it is a very rare glimpse of a woman in the brutal Roman world, which is written about by men. And
the men question.
Yes, let's.
Yes, okay.
And in the Odyssey and the Iliad, which you meander through in your book, we've got Scylla and Charybdis, and we've got Circe and the Sirens, and we've got Helen and we've got faithful Penelope waiting at home. So there's these very almost stereotypical versions of women in your book. And I was wondering how you Charlotte.
Spit it out.
This is
As we gang up on Adam.
As a classicist. This is when we turn our chairs around.
Yes, okay, I'm ready.
Let's talk about masculinity in your book. And
Yes, okay, well done, you've said it now.
About how your book really is a very personal quest for the meaning of masculinity.
Well, I don't think it is, actually. I think it's more about Homer than about the quest for masculinity. But Homer, there's no doubt that Homer is essentially male. That the view of the world is essentially male in Homer. And that, of course, women appear in it, but it is about maleness, the challenges of maleness, the opportunities, the moral dilemma of how to be a good man in the world. And when Odysseus goes to Achilles' tent, famously in the Iliad, to try and persuade him to join in the war again, he finds Achilles singing there to a lyre, and the thing that Achilles is singing is tales of men. That is men, male men, not people, not warriors, but men. And it is definitely manness that is the focus of Homer's thing. So, which is not an uninteresting subject.
And then you have
I know I'm surrounded here.
At one point.
But wait, I have more to say about this. And there are definitely women who are appallingly badly treated in the Homeric world. You know, women are for sale, women are treated as goods. In the great chariot races at the end of the Iliad, there's even a kind of calculation of how much a woman is worth. If you're going to win the chariot race, you can choose. It's like sort of the generation game as it comes past you. You can choose 3 tripods, a nice fat ox, or a woman who knows what she's about. And they are equivalent prizes. Okay. So we say all that and we leave it to one side. Then on the other side, there are women of absolutely radiant, heroic, governing beauty. And not just as decorative objects, but as people who are big and strong in the world. And that person, above all, is Penelope. And her quality, her kind of core quality that Homer says at the end of the Iliad is this thing called euagesia, which means good governance. And it's about an ability to govern yourself, but also to govern others. And she is almost like a kind of presiding goddess in Ithaca, that she ensures that flocks do well, that orchards fruit well, that she keeps these hideous, greasy, sausage-eating suitors at bay who only want to go to bed with her and nothing else, and is canny and clever. And when Odysseus comes back, she knows, and he knows, but she doesn't yet know that he knows, that their bed is made with one post, one corner post of it, a living olive tree, which he had made many years before he left for Troy. And so quite calmly and casually, in the middle of a conversation, she says, why don't we just put the bed outside tonight, you know, out in the courtyard? It'd be so much nicer to sleep out there, wouldn't it? Just to see whether he is the man she hopes he is. And he, of course, then knows that she is testing him and knows that she loves him for it, you know. And it's, you know, it's a marvellous conclusive moment. And so womanhood is complex in Homer. And I think it's, I don't know whether I quite dare say this, but I think it is trivializing to look at Homer from a sort of point of view and say how horrible women are badly treated in it. It's got too much burning of life in it to come back to that position.
Absolutely.
Charlotte, I'm not going to challenge you on that. I'm not going to challenge you on that.
Charlotte, before we go back to Roman Britain for a moment and bring up Boudicca and her terrific heroism. And I just wonder whether she's been perpetuated and because she is the only woman from that moment, or because could you just deliver her to us?
Yeah, well, I mean that's a kind of interesting shift because. Yes, it's curious. I mean, in general, it's curious being a woman dealing with this material, actually, because in the Roman Britain book, there is a genre of books that's about travelling about Roman Britain, travelling around Britain looking for Roman remains. Actually, there's a small but
don't tell anyone genre. About the other book.
Well, no, but in the 16th century, William Camden travels around as the first great antiquary. Travels around Roman Britain, finding, noting its remains and thinking great thoughts about it. In the people in the 17th and the 18th century, there were wonderful, kind of rather eccentric antiquaries who do rather similar things, journeys. But they're all men. And then Higgins comes along. You think, how do I deal with this material? This is very interesting. And there are very few women to think about in all of this. But Boudicca is a very interesting woman to think about, and she's the first. She's the first woman in British history. She's almost the first character in British history because of course, the Romans were the first to write any consistent history about Britain at all. So the moment that Julius Caesar plants his foot onto the shore at Deal or Walmer or wherever we think it is, that's the moment that Britain slips from prehistory into history, give or take a few earlier accounts, nothing of the detail of Julius Caesar writing an account of trying to conquer the place. So Boudicca is written about by Tacitus, and Boudicca was the queen of the Iceni, and who a tribe based in sort of East Anglia. And the Iceni were friendly to the Romans, and quite, it wasn't wholly a kind of negative takeover, as it were, when the Romans conquered. Some people were in alliance with the Romans, including the Iceni, but things, for one reason or another, went wrong, and Boudicca stirred up a rebellion in about 60 AD, so that's less than 20 years after the initial conquest. So there's a very new, very fragile colony and bit of conquest happening in the southeast of England, and Boudicca drums up this enormous rebellion against it, and she sweeps down and she kills everybody in St Albans, she kills everybody in Colchester, which is the capital, and she marches on London. And only then, because most of the legions are off down dealing with some druids in the west, only then does Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman leader, manage to get back and conquer, defeat Boudicca, and it's a bloody and grotesque massacre. But what's so interesting about the account that we get from Tacitus, which is the earliest and greatest account, is how ambiguous a figure Boudicca is. On the one hand, she represents this extraordinary savagery and anti-Roman values of all kinds, and her army is a great rabble. They're not the disciplined troops of the Romans. On the other hand, there's a definite kind of nobility about her. And when she makes a speech, Roman historians are very keen on giving their characters speeches to make. Her speech is rather sensible and very easy to empathise with, about how it's just wrong that the Romans should come and conquer Britain. So Boudicca is a fascinating figure, and because, as Imogen says, she's an early figure in British history, she then becomes tremendously significant in our later history, particularly if there's a woman on the throne or a woman actually in number 10. So when she resigned, or rather when she died, the banner headline in the Telegraph was, the nation says farewell to our Boudicca in pearls, or something like that. It's not straightforward being Boudicca. Boudicca was
She is
tough.
adopted. As you said, she's adopted as we go through. And Adam, in your book, there's certainly your connection with both Achilles and Odysseus. You sometimes feel more connected to Achilles, sometimes feel more connected to Odysseus. There's a really beautiful moment when you talk about being at sea in your boat and looking at the stars and realising that would have been how Odysseus would have been. But Odysseus and Achilles are two very different types of hero.
Yeah.
Achilles, the sort of obstinate man of integrity, and Odysseus, the wily avoider, or
the meanderer.
The meanderer. Yeah. And I just wondered whether you can pick and choose and be both those people through the journey of your book. It seems that you take one at one point, one at the other. Which you more like?
Well, I'm definitely more an Odysseus fan. I mean, I think the kind of picture I have is that you have Achilles, who is all about integrity and singularity and being true to what you believe in, not conforming, not loving authority, but doing what you need to do, and maybe suffering the tragic consequences of that, and he's sort of integrity here.
Yeah.
And then over here you have Hector, who is the man of the city, who looks after his brothers and sisters, whose sociability, or the kind of social vision. And Odysseus is like their child almost, or the kind of, the third term, that sometimes he can be ferociously violent and appallingly impositional and asserting his will and all the rest of it. And sometimes, often, he can lie and cheat and connive and seduce like I can.
Revelations. Your wife's in the audience.
But that's why he's got this. I say in the book, so he's got this this rubber vigor, you know, that if he's pushed, Odysseus, he bends and he bends back. He has this fantastic ability to absorb and adapt to the world that he's surrounded. You know, that every adjective that Homer applies to him has the word poly, you know, many, hooked onto the front of it. So he's polytropos, many-wayed, polymetis, many-skilled, or wonderful. One place he calls him
Polypoikilia.
Polypoikilometis, many dappled, skilled. Like his sort of abilities are just like a kind of quivering, dancing skin of a fish almost. You know? That's
Charlotte, which is your favourite of the Iliad and the Odyssey? Or do you feel one's more
It's a really interesting kind of dinner party conversation. I often have it with I often talk with writers, and do you like the Iliad or the Odyssey better? And I think
they're very carefully defined with the two different characters, aren't they?
I think it depends where you are in your life and what you need at that particular moment. I mean, the Iliad for me is the great book about death, and it's really when you're absolutely on the it's all the great things about mortality, life and death and war, and you can need that, you need that sometimes in your life. As Adam says, the Odyssey it's much more sort of novelistic, it feels now. Of course, that's an anachronistic description, but it feels like a novel. It has this wonderful kind of fairy tale quality to it. And that sense of Odysseus being the ultimate survivor, sometimes one needs that in one's life.
Do you, Charlotte, you're the classic specialist from Balliol, and Adam's only studied up to O-level, I think.
Stumbling amateur.
Stumbling amateur. I know you were interviewed at Hay yesterday, or the day before, by a professor. And in your book, you have a theory about when Homer emerged, when Homer wrote, and I wonder whether you were attacked for that yesterday, or how you're getting on in the classical world.
But everybody really sweetly says they feel a little sceptical. Oh, you had some lovely phrases about this. I'm not sure whether it was actually.
I slightly skipped over it. Subtly.
Okay, my theory. Do you want to hear my theory?
Briefly.
Very briefly. Okay, the really, really brief version is that Achilles comes from Russia. Hector basically comes from Iraq, or at least those early cities.
Should we just say what everyone else believes first?
Okay, everyone else believes that Homer is only Greek.
And came in about 800
in about
BC.
800 BC, and so that by that time Greek civilization was fully alive and going, and it had had a bad time. It had so-called Dark Ages, and as everything recovered in the 8th century BC, among many other things like the Olympic Games and new cities and colonies and coinage and so on, Homer came too. Well, I don't think that has enough explanatory power. This is the phrase I'm now defending myself with. That actually what the Iliad, above all, is about the meeting of two different ways of understanding the world. The Achilles way, which is sort of nomadic, broken, argumentative, difficult, scarcely socialized, filled with the pain of necessity, is a phrase that Auden used about it. And the other view is that society works best if you have a lovely, coherent city with everyone looking after each other, with a wall around it and families held in there. And so that obviously involves compromise and the sort of death of integrity. And so these two big conflicting principles are what animates the Iliad. And they are really the kind of conflict of the woven and the severed. That's how I see it, that Troy is full of things woven together, of cloths, of people, of the city itself as a sort of fabric. And the Greek camp is full of dissension, argument, mutual loathing, rage, contempt, and insult. And these two things meet in the great clash, which actually reflects what happened in the Aegean in about 1800 BC. And that, I think, is when Homer emerged. Homer emerged as the voice of a kind of emergent new culture, which we call Greekness, which came out of the fusion of these two different ways of seeing the world.
And you write very beautifully about it in that passage when you're in Ukraine, I think.
Yes,
when you read
yes.
from I just want you to get the feeling of the style of each book as well. We're going to ask Charlotte to read hers.
Okay, I was in Ukraine a few years ago, and in a place called Karagod. Is there anywhere as seductive or as reflective as this glow-thick grassland? It seems on these continental afternoons this might be the remembered nature of the Homeric world, the place that Homer is remembering deep in the kind of Russian steppe. On the evening I was at the Kurgan, that's the Bronze Age tumulus, the sort of Bronze Age mound like you have on the downs here. On the evening I was at the Kurgan near Karagod, a small posse of horses, roans and greys, 10 or 11 of them, their manes and tails swinging in the breeze, came down through the willows and alders in front of me. They weren't large animals, but independent, swaggering, gang-like, uncowed by work, brushing through the reed bed at the fringe of the river and on through the grass. They stood half-turned in front of me, 100 yards away. I don't know if these were wild horses, but the gap between us was electric, its charge full of suggestion and threat. It reminded me of the moment in Edwin Muir's famous 1950s post-nuclear war vision, when late in the summer strange horses came into his collapsed world. These animal companions had returned to join the human beings. We did not dare go near them, Muir wrote, yet they waited, stubborn and shy, as if they'd been sent by an old command to find our whereabouts and that long-lost archaic companionship. That remembered paradise appears again and again in Homer, not as part of the present scene of war and trouble, but as the ground against which that grief-ridden existence is compared. War occupies the raging foreground at Troy. The violence of the sea fills the Odyssey. But peace lies in the back of the mind and constantly breaks through into the surface of the poetry. Sleep sits in a pine tree in the likeness of a singing bird. Hector looks down at his baby son and thinks he's as beautiful as a star. Nature is often violent in these comparisons too, filled with wolves, lions and eagles, troubled by ferocious rivers and gales. But throughout Homer, the world of peace consistently resurfaces as a place of reproach and yearning, both memory and possibility.
Thank you. There is this, in both books, there's this recurring, a really physical feeling of landscape, and in yours as well, sea, but mostly in yours, Charlotte, is landscape. And Charlotte's book is laid out in areas, counties, so it's Norfolk and Suffolk, and there's a real sense of the physical map, the skeleton of Roman Britain laid out on which our existence is built. And I wonder, I know that Charlotte went to Sussex at the end of the book and bits in between, but there's a passage at the end of the book.
Yeah, it's a massive spoiler alert because it's the last page, but don't let that... But I thought it would be good to read because it is not so very far from here. By the way, I should say, such as the flexibility of our relationship with the past, that Boudicca, who killed everybody in Colchester, but they were the last survivors were locked into the newly built temple of the deified Claudius, and they were all burnt and killed inside. Such is the flexibility of our relationship with the past that there is a new primary school in Colchester called the Queen Boudicca Primary School. And there is also a roundabout. Colchester is not only Britain's oldest town it boasts, but also its fastest growing town now in the modern world. Really? It's got a big roundabout with a really ugly silver sculpture of Boudicca on it as well. So she's become a kind of postmodern feminist heroine for Colchester.
They just don't know, though, do they? They don't know.
Anyway, so this, yes, as I say, spoiler alert, this is the end of the book, but it doesn't sort of give anything away. There's no plot. This relates to my going to Pevensey, not a million miles from here. One cloudy early summer day, I went back to Sussex, this time to Pevensey Castle, one of the Saxon shore forts, built in the late 3rd century. Like Burgh Castle in Norfolk, its vast expanse is circled by thick flint walls, still standing to their original Roman height. Not far from here, Puck of Pooks Hill appeared to the children of Kipling's story and brought them tales of a land formed by Romans, Saxons, Danes and Normans. A land drenched in old magic, whose windy levels and stilly woods held the scars of ancient battle and were marked by the tread of gods. Inside the Roman walls are the ruins of a medieval keep, gap-toothed and jagged and lowering. William the Conqueror's army landed here in 1066. Later, his half-brother Robert held it along with the Rape of Pevensey, a wedge of its hinterland. In the 1190s, Richard I paid for building work. Later, a stone-built bailey was constructed, and it held out for over a year when besieged by Simon de Montfort's forces in 1264. In the 14th century, it belonged to John of Gaunt. In the 15th, Henry V imprisoned his stepmother, Joan of Navarre, here. Under Elizabeth I, a gun emplacement was erected to ward off Spanish invasion. During the Second World War, the castle was re-fortified. A blockhouse for anti-tank weapons was built in the Roman West Gate. Pillboxes were slotted in among the ruins. They were carefully constructed from the same flint as the rest of the castle, and so are inconspicuous. Look hard, though, and you will see the slits of machine gun posts, moments of modernist rectilinearity among the collapsed angles of ancient masonry. I think of Roman Britain and its curious bequest to us, how it has become a place where we may play out our uncertainties and anxieties about the perils of empire. A place where we might, if we chose, consider a meaning for Britain that complicates and long predates the national boundaries and identities that are now so strongly reasserting themselves. I think of Roman Britain, above all, as the place where these islands were begotten in writing, in a landscape that vibrates with stories, where every crag and moor, city and suburb, wasteland and industrial tract has been written into being. The Romans were the first to mould the land in prose. If it is to medieval literature that we owe the idea of Britain as a busy and productive and domesticated land, a fair field full of folk, then it was the Romans who first made it wild, a land of sudden mists and treacherous marshes, a territory of mountains and impassable rivers, a land as ferocious as its people. As I wandered among the ruins of Pevensey, the village was preparing for a celebration, putting up a stage in the castle precincts and warming up a barbecue. A trunk road throbbed out of sight. I walked across the levels, where a solitary cuckoo marked time, to the Martello Towers by the grey and corrugated sea. The end. That is the end.
Very fine.
That's really beautiful. Very beautifully read. I've got a couple more questions, but because it's already 1:50, I just wondered if anybody had any questions from the floor. And I think there's a lady wandering around with a mic for either Charlotte or Adam.
Could I ask a question, Charlotte, about Boudicca? How unusual was she in the classical world? Do we know of any other women leaders of tribes at that time, or was she a one-off?
She wasn't a one-off, actually. There's up in Yorkshire there was a queen called Cartimandua, who is less well, who was also allied to the Romans and is known about only in passing. She doesn't sort of hold centre stage in the way that Boudicca does, but Boudicca clearly wasn't unique. She inherits that sort of kingdom from her husband, and it's in the course of that moment that they fall out with the Romans because there's a problem in her husband's will, which causes everything, the relations, to fall apart. And yes, we know in passing about Cartimandua, so she wasn't alone. But of course, we don't know about these people from their own world. We only know about the projections that the Romans placed upon them. And there's all sorts of stuff going into the idea of a female ruler, and how bizarre and wrong and strange, and at the same time kind of frightening and exotic and glamorous and it is. So it's a very rich and strange picture that we get of her. And of course, I have no idea how those people would have seen themselves.
There was Cleopatra. I mean, yeah.
Yes.
And there are powerful Roman women.
Yes, well, and Cleopatra, you're right, because Boudicca and Cleopatra, I think, have some similarities in the way they're portrayed. Yeah, more or less, yeah.
Question for Adam. About the masculinity of Homer, is that largely...
This is all my fault. Yeah.
Is it largely to do with the fact that these were passed down orally from generation to generation by men and for men exclusively? Or would women have been would women have been part of this culture, as it were?
No, nobody knows exactly what Homer's audience was, in the Bronze Age or later. But I mean, it's essentially a male-dominated world. The Bronze Age is a hugely male-fixated world, all over Europe, all over the whole Indo-European world, right to India, and it's about dominance and it's about competition. And the role of women in that is definitely as an adjunct. I mean, it's so difficult to say anything definitive about this. I mean, there are hints and suggestions that particularly in the Hittite world, in Anatolia, that the monarchy is heritable through the female line, and that men have to marry the daughter of the king in order to become king. And there is some sort of residue of an older system, which was a sort of pre-Bronze Age system, which elevated the idea of the female much more highly. And there are suggestions that in Penelope, there may be memories of her as the person who holds the key to the kingship of Ithaca and that world, which is why to be married to her is the key for Odysseus and for all the suitors. And so there are these fragmentary hints. There's a yes.
Well, the queen of the Phaeacians is a kind of strangely powerful figure, and also the audience. The internal evidence of the poems is that the audiences contain women.
Mixed, yes.
And in Roman Britain, you had the Celtic religions. There was the horse goddess Epona, wasn't there?
Yes, although that's such a long way away. I wouldn't want to draw.
No, but there's a big picture, which is that before the Bronze Age, before the discovery of metal, and before the ability to dominate that metal gives you, there is throughout Europe and the Mediterranean and the Near East even these female great goddess mother religions, and that in some ways Greek culture inherits some of that. There are Athena is probably the most powerful figure in the Iliad, and so you're working in a mist here. There's no real telling.
There is also, I would just put in a word for Sappho, actually, because what you then start to get is a sense that Homer is being read by women, or at least a very, very, very important woman, Sappho, who really reads. She's reading Homer, she's rewriting, recrafting, reassembling Homer in her own way. So there are these sort of points of recognition that women are doing something with the material. And she's just sort of 7th, 6th century, so she's not too far off.
Any other questions? Juliet?
Can I come in?
You can come in.
Yes. 2 points. You talked about the Saxon shore. I seem to recall a rank of counter the Saxon shore. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So there is a late document relating to the disposition of Roman troops throughout the empire, and that's how we think we know about something called the Saxon shore. it's all very up for grabs and very, very fragmentary. But it's the existence of this so-called the account of the Saxon shore that gives rise to the notion that these late-ish forts along the south and east coast of Britain might have been something called the Saxon shore forts. So they are known as the Saxon shore forts without necessarily knowing if this person relates to them or not. So, we're also working in a mist here as well, a little bit. But you're quite right. That's exactly right.
The other point, I hope it won't horrify you, but I love Time Team. And I think they've done an immense service to Roman history in particular. I mean, it's captivated huge audiences. We watch it a lot, and I think it's done a great service to archaeology and particularly to the Romans. Although I don't think Mick Aston liked the Romans all that much.
Well, there's a whole thing about whose side are we on, the Romans or the ancient Britons? But
we have
Whose side are you on, Charlotte?
Yeah.
I rise above such petty.
No. But I thought I loved your book, and I thought it was written in a very un-Roman way. It was not the book that a Roman would have written about Roman Britain.
Sure.
What do you think your
Because
book
it's full of kind of fragmentary suggestion. It's not sort of laying down these very straight lines.
Well, I tell you what, Adam, I thank you. I will take that as a wonderful. I think the thing about Roman writing about Britain is that although there is this sort of authoritative, here we are, we've taken over, do as we say, what they do is lay the seeds for us to have an ambiguous relationship with their own rule. Tacitus writing about Roman Britain is also critiquing the imperial idea.
Sure.
So it would not be interesting if he was just a sort of propagandist for the Roman Empire. But the fact that he has this sympathy with characters like Boudicca and Caractacus, and particularly with a character in Scott when he's describing the very brief conquest of Scotland, and the Caledonian leader is given this great speech, which is a full-on critique of imperialism. So, it's the speech that contains the great phrase, "They made a desert and call it peace," which of course resonates. That's used all the time to. Even today, to describe certain kinds of militaristic action. So they give us the material to doubt imperialism.
And also
That's
you've got
that
the way you write is both of your books have are open-ended questions, which is always necessary when you're dealing with the ancient world, because there are no finite. There is no, if you're with archaeology, you can create a new theory, can't you, every century? Yeah. And that's what allows everybody in and keeps everybody engaged with the debate, doesn't it? And has anyone got any more questions? Because we're about to wrap. Oh, there's one more.
Julia.
Scary.
God, she did.
I just wanted to ask Adam,
for those of us... You need to say who you are.
No, I'm not.
This is like that scene in that Posey Simmons film.
I just wanted to ask Adam,
my brother.
For those of us who are putative 21st century Sapphos...
are you?
Well...
This is an announcement.
Does everyone in the audience realise this is Adam's sister?
But who did not study classics, even for O-level. Where should we begin in approaching Homer? Where should we start in our reading?
With Adam's book?
No, I would definitely start with the Odyssey. I think it's definitely, and in translation, I mean, the Greek's really difficult. And Robert Fagles is my hero. He's this wonderful American, and it's full of fire and life, and a wonderful man. He translated many different texts. Definitely Fagles' Odyssey. And
which is available in the shop.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another open-ended question then, for both of you, or either or. Opinions on the multi-authorship, split personality of Homer. There's a theory that there was more than one Homer, and the works came out of an oral tradition rather than a one-off text?
Yes, that is concentrated in my mind as the question is, were Homer women? Should we meet afterwards for this one? It's a long story.
The Homeric question in 10
Yeah.
seconds. Mind you, there is a book by Samuel Butler called The Authoress of the Odyssey, which claims or argues that the author of the Odyssey must have been a woman because he's so mean to all the men characters and so nice to all the women characters.
And
no man could have messed up the description of a boat so badly.
he puts a rudder on both ends. Gotta be a girl.
It's a hilarious. It's a great book.
Thank you.
She came from Sicily, a lovely little village on the west coast, Trapani.
Trapani.
Yeah. Have you been there?
Nice food.
Is it? You've been there?
fantastic.
I haven't been there.
I mean,
Okay,
let's go.
we'll meet there. We'll all meet there.
I'll just make an observation that Mr. Nicholson shouldn't be surprised if Mrs. Higgins didn't write like a Roman, because if she's on a quest, she's obviously going to be travelling around and thinking like Odysseus, and therefore write like him rather than like Achilles.
Very good.
Very good point.
No, that's lovely. Thank you. When someone reviewed my book, they said, of course, the urtext of what's going on behind this book is the Aeneid, which, of course, is a kind of rewriting of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I thought, is it? And I thought, I'll just take that as a wonderful compliment. Yes.
Yeah, Charlotte Higgins,
Well, I thought
Virgil.
Yeah.
Well, I thought that occurred to me that it was Virgilian. I thought it was because it loves, the transience and fadingness of things and evening.
Umbra.
The umbra, the Virgilian umbra. I think
Yeah,
that,
the kind of
I
shadow.
know it's embarrassing to say
No,
this, but
thank
it's
you.
all in there in your book, and
Thank
it's
you.
beautiful for that.
Thank you. That's very
Yeah.
kind of you.
I think we'll end then. Let them go. Have a lovin'. Let them go and have a classical lovin' over lunch.
Thank
We
you
can
all.
recommend Adam's book heartily. And, if you've got your smartphone with you, you can look up exactly what I said about it in The Guardian last week.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all three people on the platform this afternoon, Charlotte and Adam, for their wonderful evocations, their creative evocations of the classical lost worlds. I think having read both of their books, they're more than that as well. Their explorations of identity and their evocations of a sense of place is so powerful. I'd also like to thank Imogen, who is also a classicist, although she didn't. We didn't announce that right at the very beginning.
Thank
I'd
God.
also like to thank our. I think you did study classics, didn't you?
Yes, but look, very long time.
Okay. Okay.
Enough
And
already.
I'd also like to thank our sponsors for this event, very appropriately the Ondaatje Foundation, who actually have an award as one which Adam has won in the past for books which recreate a sense of place. So can you join me in thanking all our speakers?
Well done.